All right, so today we're going to talk about a few things, mainly like these other deliverables other than like your technical notebook. So first off, we'll talk about a non-technical presentation, how that should look like. What are some things that you want to emphasize or keep in mind when doing this capstone presentation, maybe versus your other presentations for your other projects. Next, I'll talk about readmes, because in your readme now, I feel like, you spent a lot of time with this project. You want to have a good readme to just, have something to show for it. Employers, if they were to go see your product, your readme is the first thing they see. So that's going to be really important. And then depending on time, I'll talk about your GitHub as a whole. As some of you are already talking with your career coaches, preparing your GitHub such that it looks good, that your entire GitHub profile, not just each individual project, but also, your profile page, how much activity you have on GitHub, that's also kind of important. So depending on how much time we have after I talk about the first two, we'll talk more about GitHub and then continue on Thursday as well. All right, so to begin with presentations, one thing that I wanted to mention before we get into like the detail of it is that presentations for capstones, some students actually like to use their recorded presentations to put on like their LinkedIn or on their, I don't know, if you have like a YouTube page, or if you have, I don't know, you can also like put it in your like Medium blog about your project, just because sometimes it's just easier for people to learn more about project through a presentation. So keep that in mind. Why this presentation could be more important is because you might want to use this presentation to like share about your project and share about, your achievement over this like 2-month-long project. As usual, we're doing our presentation 2 weeks from today, and will be recorded as well. If any of y'all can't make it during that time, we'll do our presentation during our review slot. And if you want, I can have that recorded as well, because sometimes it's easier to record a presentation when you're talking to someone else versus recording it on your own. So with that context, just know that like you might want to use your presentation as part of your marketing yourself for a job. You don't have to. I personally didn't do that. I don't like myself on video, but just so you know, that is something that you can do, and something that some students I've seen on LinkedIn do. You can just get more traction. You get people interested in what you're working on. So yeah, I think it could be something that you use to get yourself out there. So with presentations, knowing that this is something that I might not be the only person seeing, and of course this class, like you might want to show other employers what you're like through this presentation, what your project was, I think is important to really like nail down what are the things to focus on in this presentation. I think non-technical presentations are a balance of two main things. One, how useful is your project? Like, why did you do this project? And like, why this project should make someone be like, oh, that's a pretty interesting, cool project, right? I think that's something that really draws people in. And then also you have to balance like sharing what technical things you did in a non-technical way. So just to recap, the two things is one, showing the significance of your project, I'll say these autocompletes are getting better. And then also sharing your technical work to a non-technical audience. Wow, that's crazy. All right. So let's start with the first part, showing the significance of your project. Here is where you should really, really nail down your business case. If you feel like your project is used for something very, very specific, I would say really think about how a company could incorporate your project as part of what they do. If you're doing some sort of like detection project or classification project, try and like make up a scenario where a company would use, your final model that you created. If you're doing forecasts, what kind of companies are going to be using your forecasts? You can make up companies and make up specific scenarios, but you really want to demonstrate how your project is going to be useful for someone else. there are a lot of products out there that are like created just to be like cool and like fun. But I do think that especially if you're looking for, you know, presenting yourself to be someone that's useful for a company, I think that would be really, really helpful. Again, it's to varying degrees depending on what your product is and like what kind of data your project's using, or like how broad the scope is of your project. But I really think that that is something that I was a little bit more lax on in the prior presentation that I'm really going to emphasize with this round of presentation. So really nail down your business case. How is your project going to be useful for a company or person? So that's really more of like the very beginning of your presentation, right? Framing your project. Questions about this? All right. I'm gonna organize this a little bit different. At the beginning of your presentation, do this. So the part of your presentation where the business case kind of comes back is the end of your project, end of your presentation. And again, this order of how you present your stuff is very, very subject to change. This is really based on like the presentation templates that I sent out at the start. So towards the end of your presentation, likely this is after you share your technical stuff, after sharing meat of the project. This is usually where you come back and like round it back together, right? In our rubrics, there's like a section for recommendations and conclusions, and like whether you're able to provide either actionable insights or actionable next steps for a company to take. So towards the end of your presentation, I think it's very, very important to link your conclusions back to your business case. Again, this can come out differently based on what your project's business case is, but it is important to make these conclusions link back to your business case. In a lot of your projects, and I mean, I think I personally also did this as well. A lot of my conclusions were like, okay, this is my feature importance. The most important feature here was whether it rains or not. And then that is my conclusion. But I think now that we're doing our capstone, if the most important feature is whether it rains or not, go a little bit deeper. That's why I say a post-modeling EDA is very important. So through a post-modeling EDA, you can say, all right, well, in conclusion, whether it rains or not can help to predict help to predict the likelihood of a tornado in the next 3 days, for example. That's something that could link back to my business case that maybe is a tornado detection thing. So it is hard to speak about it vaguely, or not vaguely, but like generally, but link your conclusions back to your business case. Here, it doesn't even have to be technical, right? I mean, it could be something that you present in like part of your technical conclusion or modeling results, but it would be really, really helpful to, yeah, really hammer down that you link your conclusions back to your business case. Possibly aided by post-modeling EDA. Or your EDA, if your conclusions just happen to be something that you noticed from, you know, even before you started modeling, that's something that you can do. Other than that, this is also a really good step, a really good place to talk about some of the shortfalls or limitations of your project. A limitation could be maybe a low accuracy score. Another limitation could be this doesn't take into consideration like other classes of data, perhaps. So just to show your understanding of the business case that you constructed, it's really good to talk about limitations. So to show your understanding of the business case constructed, what are some limitations or shortfalls of your project in its current state? This also kind of leads to future work. And future work is something that I think all of you have incorporated in your past presentations. And future work is usually things like, I've seen a lot of cases of like, oh, get more data. Yeah, obviously that's like a good thing that would help with your project. Maybe you want to like study other kinds of pre-processing techniques. For example, let's say you did like, let's say you did TF-IDF for your project and you want to study word embeddings. If you say something like incorporate word embeddings because you had only used TF-IDF, you should mention why using word embeddings would help your project or help your business case. Mention why word embeddings will or might/will help with your project and support the business case. So with this example, let's say your project, you only use TF-IDF and your future work includes word embeddings. It's again important to link back to the business case. Let me actually like bold this point here. So you could say something like, oh, using word embeddings would allow the model to consider I don't know, to consider order of words or context instead of just frequency of words used. So it's important that in your future work, you're not just like listing out like, oh, I could add this, but it's important to be more thoughtful about your future work. Because let's say if your model is a TF-IDF model and it performs great, and I don't know, maybe there's a specific scenario where the context doesn't matter as much. I don't know, I can't think of anything right now. But yeah, you want your future work to be more thoughtful in that respect. So really take some time. I know a lot of times these presentations are something that students like to throw together like right before a project is due. And yeah, I do think it is important to be more thoughtful about your future work. Because future work is usually like, all right, what didn't I do in this project? List. I think you can go one level deeper in this case. Any questions at this point? All right. Okay, so that's more of like the business case important part of your project, like showing how significant it is, showing your understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. All right, next let's talk about, and here, I just want to change the heading here. There we go, okay. Okay, so the next part, sharing your technical work to a non-technical audience. This is probably the part where you're talking about like your EDA, your modeling, post-modeling. I will say it does depend how technical you want to get. I've seen like projects that don't even talk about their modeling process at all, and they really focus on the business case. That can sometimes be a good thing. If you have a lot to say about the context surrounding your project, that might be better. But yeah, I've also seen like good explanations of models. If you're comfortable explaining like the model that you use in a non-technical way, I think that's a good opportunity to show that off as well. So here, definitely there's like some different degrees of which you can do this. Things that I think are important to share. One slide at least on your data. One slide about your data. I think especially now where, I don't know, I feel like it's getting a little bit more mainstream where machine learning and AI can kind of be, what's the word? Like people can sort of push back at like AI developments and machine learning developments because of, unfair or biased data being used, right? We see these like big, I don't know, Netflix documentaries on I don't know, like social networks creating echo chambers or recommendation systems leading to more bias. So talk about your data. You have to show that the data that you're using, you're aware of. And this can also lead back to your limitations, honestly. But yeah, just be very upfront about what the data you're using is. If you think that it is representative or not representative of real life, for example, like if this data set that you're using it more of like a proof of concept, and you do intend on using it on like a different or bigger data set in the future, I think that's a good thing to mention as well. So let's see, to summarize that part, regarding your data, be upfront about what it is. It is, where it comes from. I think something that's getting more and more important is time frame, just because like things are changing at a much faster pace as it was like decades ago. Could it be biased? Is there, is it more for a proof of concept, or is this project intended for a different or greater data set? So these are things that you can think about regarding your data. And it also, this is a really good place to like really provide even more context for your project. Okay, questions about this? All right, and this, I know in prior projects, I mentioned that you could give very, very high level EDA. High level EDA, i.e. maybe like distribution of your target variable. And the distribution of your target variable, by the way, I think is a really, really good tool to contextualize your error metrics. So for example, some of you are working on regression projects, or like forecasting projects. And let's say you're forecasting the price of, let's just say the price of Bitcoin, which is right now at like what, 60,000? With a price of 60,000 and you're using like Bitcoin data over the past year, if your RMSE ends up being something like 10,000 versus something like 1,000, having the 60,000 number to compare it to, that really helps you contextualize your RMSE. Because sometimes if you just flat out see an RMSE of 10,000, maybe people will be like, oh, that seems like a lot. But you do want to compare that to maybe the mean and standard deviation of Bitcoin prices, just as an example. So high level EDA, like distribution of your target variable, very, very important. If you have a class imbalance that you're dealing with and you want to talk about that, distribution of your target variable is going to be very, very important to share. So I think this is what you got to say about like introducing your data. Questions so far? All right. So next, after introducing your data, as we know, the next step is EDA. And EDA, I think at this point, you can get a little bit more creative with how you want to do your EDA. Because I'm emphasizing post-modeling EDA a lot, if you feel like your post-modeling EDA is way more significant than your pre-modeling EDA, maybe show a lot less of your EDA. So here, or now you can balance pre-modeling versus post-modeling EDA. What is more significant to share with your audience? Cool. So because your post-modeling EDA is more likely to connect with your conclusions, I just think that if you want to like do a little bit less like, okay, this is an overview of my data, these are all the histograms, it might be a lot more meaningful to just show your post-modeling EDA. And I feel like EDA, I think I talked about this last time as well, no graph dumps. Have every visualization, make sure every visualization is relevant to your narrative, and also well labeled and annotated. So again, don't forget to check your axes. That's one big thing. Check axes labels and scale. And if you have a lot of, for example, let's say you have like a bar graph with like 20 different bars and you really want to highlight certain things, feel free to use like your PowerPoint tools, your slide tools, I don't know, arrows or boxes to annotate. I will say like for the capstone, because people already have so much to say about their project, usually I don't see a lot of graph dumps, but again, just wanted to make sure. Don't throw all of like the distributions of all your features in there because a lot of it's not going to be relevant. All right. Any questions before we move on to modeling? Okay. So with your modeling, I think the most important thing is going to be your final model. And how you arrange this section is really up to you and how you think you can best share succinctly how you are working through this project. But your final model is going to be most important. Most important and relevant. No one cares about, I mean, not no one cares, but like if in like a 5 to 8 minute presentation, you don't have time to talk about like the 10 different models that you used. Some useful things that I've seen in past presentations that have been really great to like show off your modeling process. Let's see. Great ways to show modeling process succinctly. There we go. Model summary tables, like model results summary tables. Model results summary tables. That's like a really, if you had like a data frame that put all of your results together, that's a really, really quick and easy way to be like, all right, yeah, see, I ran all of these models, and in that way you just show how many models you ran if you ran a bunch. And it's also a really quick way. It's like, well, obviously I chose this model because, you know, this metric did the best here. And so you can always like, I don't know, use like draw a box around the best model that you use around on that like row if it's not sorted. So that's like a really, really good way to show your modeling process. If not, just like a quick line about like that process. I think if you ran like a great number of models, let's say you're doing classification, you ran like 10 different models, just mention that you ran 10 different models. I don't think it's important to talk about your each model that you ran, especially when it's a capstone presentation, you worked a lot on it. That's not something that you want to focus on. With your modeling, it is still important to compare to a baseline, and how you do this can be different. Important to compare to a baseline or just some other models that you're using, or other models, or 1 or 2 other models. Or 1 to 2 other models to contextualize your improvements. So maybe when you're presenting your final results and you introduce your final model accuracy as, wow, I can't type. When you introduce your final model accuracy as 80%, how is that compared to your baseline or first model? So that will just show that, all right, you tuned all these hyperparameters. How much did that tuning really help? Or maybe you started with like the scikit-learn dummy classifier. That again just shows that, well, this model obviously does so much better. And I think that's important to talk about the improvement in your model. From here, with the model metrics, actually, let's move this back one. With your model metrics, again, important to contextualize. If you used accuracy, or like, actually, even so, maybe you don't have to go so much into detail like why you use a certain metrics, why you use a certain metric, but what does an accuracy of 80% mean? This, of course, will be different if you have binary problem or multi-class problems. And also depending on your business case. If you are looking at recall, are you looking at a average recall over all of your classes, or are you looking at the recall for a specific class? At recall over all classes or a specific class. And what does an 80% recall on class 2, for example. Questions about this? Cool. And then again, it really depends on what kind of model that you're doing, but what important information do you get after you train your model? Or what relevant information are you getting after training model or fitting your model? In this case, a lot of times for like tree models, you have your feature importances. Maybe you have like coefficients for regression. Perhaps you have, I don't know. I would say this is more specific for like recommendation systems as well, but maybe you want to compare like your predicted ratings to your actual ratings. So maybe you're looking at residuals. And this information, again, would like feed into post-modeling EDA and then would feed into your conclusions. I recognize that there's a lot of information here, especially if you want to fit it all into like a 5 to 8 minute presentation. This seems like a lot. I will say for this capstone presentation, more than happy to look over your slides and talk about what you may want to include, might want to exclude. Because I recognize that it's hard to sometimes pick and choose, all right, what is an audience going to care more about? But these are things that generally audiences do care about. So yeah, feel free to talk to me if you wanted more guidance on this stuff. So after talking about your model, it really just goes back to the conclusion and future work. So I think that covers presentations. All right, any questions at this point before we move on to talking about preparing your Readme?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a bit more about like what the audience is? Because you say you want to make it to a non-technical audience, but I guess we're supposed to assume some sort of technical sophistication in this regard.
So something that I actually, that's a really good question, because sometimes it's not clear. Like you can say non-technical, but it's really like there are different degrees of like technical and non-technical. I definitely recognize that. Something I actually learned from another instructor is that in doing these presentations, some instructors actually ask students, okay, who do you want your audience to be in this case? So I've seen cases in like, maybe you are working for like a consulting company and then you want to pitch your project idea to someone who's consulting for a company. And of course, in that kind of scenario, yeah, it would be non-technical, but they want to know some technical elements. Yeah, I think that could be something that we do if you want to like really narrow down how to create this presentation and who you're creating this presentation for. Yeah, I think if you want to do that, you can perhaps indicate who your audience is. And maybe this is dependent on your business case. Like maybe your business case is surrounding like something that a company might use. And then maybe the audience is company stakeholders. It's very similar to what we did with our very first project. So yeah, if you think that would be helpful to you, because I think if I were to tell you who your audience is, it might not always apply because it's going to be different for every project. So yeah, I think if you want to like indicate who you're giving this presentation to, either let me know so that when I'm giving you comments, I can be more aware of that. Or if you want to just mention that before you officially set your presentation, I think that's a good idea. Yeah, you can definitely do that too. I think that'll help give a lot more direction. That's a good question. Anything else? All right. All right, I'll go back in and I'll clean this up before resharing it back out to you all. Okay, next let's talk about our readmes. I think I've mentioned before that readmes are very, very subjective. So I'm just gonna go through some like main things that you might consider when putting together your readme. First to start, I am aware that a lot of my readmes too are it's very, very similar content to what's in your presentation. And that's completely fine. I think readmes also, you can play around more with how technical you get. Because if you think about it, someone who's going onto your GitHub, they are probably someone that's a little bit more technical if they intend on looking at your code. So one point to just start with is likely similar information as your presentation, but you can play around with how technical you get with the assumption that someone going to your README might want to check out your code. No matter what kind of README you want to put together, and again, I think I've shared like a few examples. I've seen like very, very long, detailed READMEs that almost read like a blog. I've also seen like very, very succinct READMEs where it literally is like, all right, I did this, 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 link to notebook, link to notebook, link to notebook. I think it really depends on how you write, but the main thing is you want to really focus on clarity. So no matter what style of README you're doing, focus on maximizing clarity. I don't know, I always feel like I want to share that this became very, very important to me when I heard from a recruiter that he spends an average of 15 seconds looking at a README. So there are many different ways at looking at like trying to maximize clarity. You want to really reel someone in or get them to want to spend more than 15 seconds looking at your project. So what are the main things to highlight? Actually, let me unindent this. Some things to highlight. There we go. Some things to highlight, obviously, what is your project? Let me just pull up like a random, actually, let's pull up our study group. It's here. So on your GitHub page, there are several things that you can, there are several elements that you can use to help make your README even more succinct. So first of all, your repo name. Name your repo something that is indicative of what it is. I feel like, sure, it can be Capstone now, but you definitely want to change this name later on such that, you know, if someone's going to your profile page, just as an example, if someone goes to your profile page and want to like check out your projects, mine aren't the best, but let's say I want to see, okay, how does Ish do with like classification projects? And here you can see classifier. Here there's classifier. This becomes obvious. So make use of the repo name and then also the description of the project. Here, this study group repo doesn't have a description, but each of these, this is all like the description. So as an example, this was my capstone project. And then here I put some like about, so it becomes even more clear on what the project is. I will say that also when you do like a GitHub search for projects, they do it on like the description as well. So make use of project title and description to help. So is your project a classification project? Is it regression? Maybe you have a project that you're focusing on like creating a front end. That's something that you could do as well. But I think, you know, just for like immediate clarity, don't put something like, I don't know, maybe you're doing like movie analysis. Well, our first project was very much like just movie analysis, but movie analysis, there's so many different, the word analysis is kind of vague and like, are you doing like just an EDA analysis? Are you doing an analysis that comes from some modeling results? So yeah, definitely want to talk about, definitely you want to mention with a little bit more clarity, like what kind of analysis you're doing. So what is your project? Do that. Next, I think I've seen people do this in different ways, but somehow just incorporate what you did, right? And yes, that structure is very much taken from your presentation, but what did you did in your project? What did you do in your project? I've seen it just as like a single overview section, and they really do like EDA, modeling, post-modeling, actionable insights. and maybe each of those link to another section, or maybe each of them link to like a notebook. That's also possible, but those are important to do. Something that you may or may not incorporate here is also like, what technologies did you use? This is, I would say, it's good if your project includes like a lot of other things. So if you're just doing like a Jupyter notebook project, I think it's a little bit less relevant. I would say here it would be especially if you used a database or a front end. I would say that those are good things to mention. Other than that, I think for your README, it really depends on what you want to highlight. So sometimes you want to highlight, especially, okay, let's just, as an example, so your very first project, the very first project had no modeling involved, which is fine, right? I think a lot of people's like first data science jobs might not even include modeling. So maybe you want to focus on that. If you're doing the project like that, the main work or the main like value added part of your project is in your ability to make actionable, create actionable recommendations. So you want to focus on that. If, let's say, you created a classification project to like detect, I don't know, what was that lung x-ray one? Like whether someone has pneumonia or not, you would talk more about that and the implications of that, or like what are some of the results you got. I will say, yeah, README is going to be a little bit more technical than your presentation, but yeah, it is very, very subjective. Which is why I feel like in the past I haven't been very like nitpicky on your READMEs, because yeah, it is just that subjective. But these are some of the main points to think about and keep in mind. You want to be as clear as possible, and then just think about as someone who, so let's say you want to, a good way to think about it that someone actually shared with me, let's say imagine you are trying to look for a project partner, and you can only choose your project partner through looking at their READMEs and their GitHub repo. How would you then market your own README to make yourself look like an attractive project partner? That's one thing that really helped me decide how I want to frame my README. I personally like to put like, I don't know, I think in terms of like verbiage, I'm a little bit more informal with my verbiage, just because that's the kind of, I don't know, that's kind of vibe that I want to put out there. So you can really play around with that as well. But yeah, that was a README. We're at 6:45. So I think I will talk more about like GitHub as a whole and like how you can really maximize your GitHub on Thursday. But at this point, does anyone have any questions regarding this? I know most of you are probably not working on your READMEs or presentations yet, but because we only have like 2 weeks of study groups left, wanted to put this here. And I will clean this up and I'll link this to our homeroom. But yeah, any questions to end off? All right, let me stop the recording here.